Public Library. And thank you all for being here, especially our speaker. I think it's time we all had some fun in these difficult times. So thanks to Claire McNear, author of Answers in the Form of Questions. We're going to get it. Thank you, Claire. Claire is a staff writer at The Ringer. And I have to tell you, Claire, that I am very annoyed at The Ringer because my partner does nothing all day but listen to The Ringer. It's one of the most popular podcasts, if not the most popular around. And that being said, I couldn't help myself. The answer is Claire McNair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you to Union Public Library, and thank you to all of you who tuned in today to talk about this wonderful little quiz show. I don't know if I guess I'll start with a little bit of background about me, Debbie. I think you have some questions, but before we get to those, as she mentioned, my name is Claire McNear, and I'm a staff writer at The Ringer. I cover a little bit of sports, a little bit of pop culture, and a little bit of everything in between, from food to politics to tech. And I, like many of you perhaps, have long been a fan of Jeopardy. And I, a few years back, moved in with my now fiance, and we got cable, and I hadn't had cable throughout college, didn't have it right after college. And I had this epiphany that, oh my God, we could start taping Jeopardy and watch it every night together and play along. And as I started to watch it more, I got more and more invested, and I began writing about it at The Ringer, because I like to joke that it is the perfect collision of sports and culture, where it's a TV show that if you squint at it, I at least believe that it is kind of a sport. So I spent a few years reporting on Jeopardy periodically, and in the midst of James Holzhauer's incredible winning streak back in 2019, I wrote a big story about how he was using the buzzer to kind of help himself play, and talked to a whole bunch of people who worked for the show, talked to James, talked to Ken Jennings. And as I got to know more people in that world and discovered that there were a lot of people like me who were way too interested in Jeopardy, that there was this kind of huge universe of fans who were interested in the nitty-gritty of it, eventually that became a book. So my book, Answers in the Form of Questions, came out in November, and it gets into strategy and the history of the show and the Art Fleming days, and what Merv Griffin did to make the show happen, and of course Alex Trebek. And I also got to spend a whole bunch of time with the actual contestants, as well as Trebek and a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. So Debbie, I don't know if you had any questions, or I can just keep rambling, whatever works best for you.
Hi, of course I have questions. The first question is, I think we need to take a moment to honor Alex Trebek. And if you could tell us a little bit about what was he really like off camera?
Yeah, absolutely. I am so incredibly grateful that I got to spend some time with him as I was working on this book. And tragically, he actually passed away just 2 days before my book came out. So it was incredibly bittersweet timing. And I mean, at least for me, it has also been an excuse to get to spend a lot of time talking about him. So I'm grateful for that. But I think so much of the magic of Trebek was really that he kind of did walk the walk. One of the favorite things that I learned as I was talking to contestants while I was working on the book is that at the end of an episode of Jeopardy, you can see the host go over to the contestant lecterns, and at least in pre-COVID times, Trebek would kind of lean over, he'd shake the champion's hand, and he'd do some kind of chit chat as the credits rolled, but you couldn't hear what he was saying. And what I learned from a lot of contestants is that 9 times out of 10 what he was doing in those moments was just talking about the final Jeopardy clue. Like, he wanted to know how, if they got it, how did they work it out? Did they get the hint that was buried in the clue somewhere? Or if they're totally heartbroken and just missed it and just lost on Jeopardy, and this kind of lifelong dream for a lot of people has come to an end, he would kind of razz them a little bit and be like, oh, come on, you knew that, like, don't you remember seeing this in the news? And he really cared about the trivia. And I mean, I remember being really nervous the first time that I met him, because for me, he was such kind of a towering authoritative figure, and I was so worried that maybe I would mispronounce something, or maybe he had some trivia clue that he was going to ask me the moment I sat down in his green room with him. And fortunately for me, that was not the case. But he was really lovely, and he had just an incredible sense of humor and this incredible warmth, and really kind of cut loose as soon as the camera stopped rolling.
So what is it about Jeopardy? Why is it so popular? And why is it ranked among the top syndicated shows?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of one of the fundamental sort of mysteries of Jeopardy that I really wanted to get into in the book, because Jeopardy has been on the air in some form or another since the 60s. The Trebek version has been on since 1984, and has been pretty much like a mega hit consistently since then. So we're, you know, into the 37th season of this kind of rebooted version of the show in syndication, and it is consistently, as you just said, rated amongst one of the top shows, period, in syndication. And periodically we'll have these, you know, during a tournament or an incredible run like James Holzhauer's, will outrank like major sporting events in like a given year, which is crazy. And it's just, you know, it's trivia doesn't usually make for must-see television. So what is it about Jeopardy? And I think what it is that above all, Jeopardy has really perfected kind of like the difficulty of the clues, where it's hard material, but it's not so hard that it isn't fun to play along with. Like if you were watching from home and they just asked 61 clues as they do in a game of Jeopardy, but you barely had heard of any of the things, it wouldn't be fun to watch, because the fun of Jeopardy, right, is to play along with the people you're sitting on the couch with and like pretend you're not keeping track of who's getting more right answers, but like maybe you are. And Jeopardy has always been built more for the people watching from home than for the three people actually playing on the stage. And they've really just done an incredible job with that balance of it. And that actually is very much a testament to Trebek. In the show's first 3 seasons of the reboot, so starting in 1984, he was not just the host, but he was also the producer. He was the one running Jeopardy in addition to hosting it. And he very consciously made that decision that he wanted it to be academic, but he also kind of wanted it to be a little bit populist. He didn't want to dumb it down. He's very clear about that. I think he kind of feuded with Regis Philbin when Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was a big hit, about the clues being too easy, the questions being too easy, and the contestants maybe not being quite as bright as a Jeopardy contestant. But on Jeopardy, he wanted it to be a pure environment and an academic environment, but also one that's fun for people to play along with.
That's great. I want to encourage everybody to put questions in the chat box if you know how to use that. If you don't know how to use that and you have your picture up, just raise your hand and we'll help you figure it out. So what is a day, you were on the Jeopardy set, what does it feel like and what's it like?
Yeah, so the Jeopardy set is this fascinating place. They tape in Culver City, California, and they actually are adjacent to Wheel of Fortune, which I didn't even really know until I started writing about Jeopardy. They're sister shows. They're run by the same executive producer. They were both created by Merv Griffin. They share a lot of their crew, so a lot of the people who run the cameras and the microphones, that kind of stuff, you know, work at Jeopardy, and then on the days that they're not working on Jeopardy, walk across the alleyway to work on Wheel of Fortune. So it very much is kind of a communal family. Jeopardy is interesting because they tape 5 games a day on each of their tape days, and they have 46 tape days a year, with 2 back-to-back, usually it's in 23 weeks. So it's a very good gig to be the host of Jeopardy. Trebek was said to make somewhere between $10 and $20 million for 46 days of work a year. So he had a pretty good thing going on. But they're very, very long tape days. So Trebek would get there at 6 a.m. and he would sit down in his office with the day's game material for all 5 of those games. So that's the Monday through Friday game, no matter what day of the week it actually was. And he'd crack open a dictionary and he would mark up the clues with diacritical marks and practice getting the pronunciation just right. Like, I think so many of us who love Jeopardy loved how Trebek would, you know, so say his very fancy pronunciations of, I will not attempt it, but the very French pronunciation of like genre. And those things were great because he worked at them. So meanwhile, as all of that is happening, the contestants roll in and they usually put them in the same hotel, not very far from the stage. And they're all kind of nervously in this bus together and then just sort of sucked into the whirlwind of Jeopardy and are kind of under surveillance from that moment till they leave the set. So it's this very fascinating, very intense thing. And another really interesting thing about Jeopardy is that they're really good at making Jeopardy there. I mean, that of course seems kind of obvious, but when you watch them tape a game of Jeopardy, they tape it really in about the 22 minutes that it actually takes for the Jeopardy portion of a half hour to air. Like there's very little stopping and starting. There's very little editing to cut down weird delays or anything like that. Trebek would occasionally misspeak and they would, retape some tiny segment, but contestants always describe it as just like the fastest half hour of your entire life because it just blazes by. It is so fast.
Somebody was asking about Alex's reactions to bios, that sometimes he's a little bit whatever.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I love that. And I think that for a lot of Jeopardy fans, that's probably kind of a favorite part of watching those Trebek episodes, because during that Q&A and right after the first commercial break, he of course would have this kind of occasionally sort of salty exchange with contestants who had like a particularly unusual hobby, or mentioned their cat a few too many times, as I'm going to today, as she keeps going back and forth. But I think what that was, I've heard from people who watch the show and they worry that Trebek was being mean, that he was hurting their feelings, that he was kind of embarrassing them. But really what I think it is, and from having talked to a lot of the people who had him kind of tease them on stage, they pretty uniformly loved it. Like it was the highlight of their Jeopardy experience to get sort of made fun of by Alex Trebek on stage on national TV. And I think what that was he kind of cultivated this character. I mean, like I said, I think a lot of it was true to who he was, and that he was a very academic person. He did care about trivia, and he thought it was important to know stuff about Mark Twain or the Kings of England. Like he really believed those things, but he also knew that people kind of liked this disappointed dad character, this like, like you've really let me down with that one, where he kind of squints, and he really perfected it. And he knew that audiences loved that. So, I mean, I think he was always kind of, in addition to everything else, he was a performer, and he was a very good performer. And he originally saw game shows as just sort of a way station to being an actor. He said many times after he moved to Los Angeles from Canada that he didn't want to do game shows forever, that he envisioned that being the way that he would get into other kinds of acting. And of course, fortunately for us, he stuck around with Jeopardy because I think he really fell in love with it. But he really was a performer.
So how did Jeopardy begin? What was the original formula? Who came up with it? And what about the song?
Yeah, so there's some really great old Jeopardy history. So to kind of explain the show's origins, you have to go a ways back to the 1950s quiz show scandals, which many of you may be aware of, but if you've seen the movie Quiz Show, the Robert Redford movie, that sort of details it. But what happened in the 1950s was, in the heyday of network TV, there were these mega popular quiz shows that make Jeopardy seem like just a nothing burger today. Just absolute sensation of shows, 21 and a whole bunch of others. Now on the show 21, a contestant came on named Charles Van Doren, and he was a good-looking young guy, and he taught at Columbia, and he was from kind of a notable New York family. They filmed the game in New York, and basically the producers thought this guy will make for pretty good TV, and he was bright. But then from that, they basically manufactured this incredible winning streak for him, and it was sort of a Ken Jennings-esque, of course, with some skullduggery behind the scenes, Ken Jennings-esque winning streak, in that it was front page news and people were kind of rapturously tuning into the game show week after week after week to see, oh my goodness, like, is he going to keep winning? And what was actually happening, of course, was the producers were, giving him some of the right answers. They were in some cases having his contestants throw games. So even if they knew the answers, they were having them pretend to mess it up. And that was happening on some other very popular games shows also. So then that came out in the 50s, and that became, of course, this huge scandal, and there were congressional hearings, and tried, like, a grand jury was involved, and President Eisenhower condemned the people who had been part of this scheme, and Van Doren kind of became a pariah. And one of the interesting things that came out of that is that Congress actually amended the Communications Act And ever since then, ever since I think it passed in 59, give or take, I might be off by a couple of years, but ever since then, it has literally been a federal crime to cheat on a quiz show. So in the years immediately after this, nobody wanted to watch quiz shows. Nobody wanted to make quiz shows because they had this horrible scandal and nobody believes that any of it was real. And meanwhile, Merv Griffin, who was, you know, still quite young, still quite early in his career, really wanted to create a quiz show. He was very interested in exploring that form, and he was as the story goes, he was on an airplane with his wife Julianne and just talking about this, lamenting the state of quiz shows and how nobody would buy a quiz show even if he came up with them, and even though it would of course not have any cheating involved, nobody would watch it, nobody would, you know, make this happen. And Julianne proposed something quite creative, which was, what if you just give them the answers? What if you do the thing that is now explicitly illegal? And that, of course, is the conceit of Jeopardy. They just hand over the answer, but then you have to guess the question. So it is this really explicit, you kind of nose thumbing at what was then a very, very, very recent scandal. So there is this kind of playfulness inherent to Jeopardy. And I feel like you had a second question on the back end of that I have since forgotten about. So I'm not sure if there was another bit of it.
That's okay. So somebody is asking if you wrote a book. So let's use this opportunity to plug the book.
Yes.
Again, which is
answers in the form of questions. Yeah, you can, I will ramble plenty here, but I ramble much more about Jeopardy and its wonderful history and great contestants and everything right in here. So
I can say that it was fun to read it. It was really fun to read it, and you do get a lot of information. So, okay, we're all going to go on Jeopardy now.
26.
Excuse me, we're all going to go on Jeopardy now. And so how do we do that?
Yeah, so it is really hard to get on Jeopardy is the main thing. That's the headline about how to get on Jeopardy. And I talked to a whole lot of very, very, very bright people who have spent years, decades trying to get on Jeopardy and have not been able to yet. And so the basics of it are that each year somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people take the online Jeopardy contestant test, and they quite recently rolled out the anytime test. So I think you can just go to jeopardy.com and you can just, you know, click into the test whenever you want. You could do it right now, you could do it as soon as we're done here today, you could do it tomorrow. And what that test is 50 questions, and it's very much like what you would see on Jeopardy. It's very academic stuff, but some pop culture stuff. You don't have to do the what is, who is, and it's sort of course, an honor system where I think they give you about 8 seconds to answer each question, but they don't tell you how you do. So it is thought that 35 out of 50 is a passing score. And what happens then, so I said between 80 and 100,000 people take the online test. Of that number, only about 2,500 people are invited to auditions every single year. So just a tiny fraction of the total number of people who take this test. And of course, those are usually in person. This year, they are all on Zoom. And of that 2,500, at auditions, they make you take a second test. So it's 50 questions again, but it's a different test with the same sort of Jeopardy-esque material. And then you kind of do a mock Q&A and a mock game in front of the producers and the contestant coordinators. And so of that 2,500 who make it to that stage, only about 400 people are invited to Jeopardy every single year. So it's super, 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 super selective. I will not try to run that math in my head, but you can do it if you've got a calculator somewhere nearby. So it's very, very tough. And there are people who try for many years to get on the show. And like I said, I mean, it's very bright people. Also, I talked to James Holzhauer a lot about this. And I mean, of course, if any of you watched that incredible winning streak, I mean, he won 32 games and $2.5 million. I talked to him about how he actually got on Jeopardy, this incredibly, incredibly bright person. And he took the online test 13 years straight. It used to just be an annual thing. He took it 13 times. He got invited to an audition once, never heard back from them, got invited to an audition a second time, and that was when he finally got invited to Jeopardy. So it is so hard. It is really tough competition. But you know, people do it. 400-ish people every single year get to go on Jeopardy. So the kind of crushing other side of that is fully 3/4, it's just under 3/4 of all contestants on Jeopardy lose their very first game. So it's tough. It's really tough, especially, I mean, knowing what goes into actually making it to that stage. I mean, your odds are good that you will just lose and be sent home. And Jeopardy actually doesn't even pay for contestants to fly to LA. They don't pay for your flights. They don't pay for your hotel unless you're the returning champion. If you're just there to try it out, you're paying your own way. So if you come in third place in that first game, they give you $1,000, which you will have to pay tax out of, California income tax and federal tax and all of that. But you will also have to pay for your flight from perhaps the East Coast and your hotel in Los Angeles. So actually, a lot of people who go on Jeopardy end up losing money.
Wow. Well, it looks so easy. You know, when you're sitting at home, of course, we all know the answers to everything. Is there some strategy involved to win?
Yeah.
How do you win?
How do you win? I wish there were a magic formula that would result in that always. There are a lot of strategies, some of which, from watching Jeopardy, you might be aware of. Things like, they call it the forced bounce, which is when contestants kind of jump all over the board. And part of that, of course, is looking for daily doubles, which offer this wonderful opportunity to win a bunch more money, and also to keep your opponents from winning a bunch more money, which is just as important, if not more important. And then there are strategies like James Holzhauer, who kind of went laterally along the bottom of the board, which was also sort of daily double hunting, but it was also because he was just trying to rack up as much money as he could, as quickly as he could. And that's, of course, how he got to those eye-popping totals. I think he has 21 of the top 25 Jeopardy scores ever. So that is a big part of it. And also kind of studying the math behind things like how much to wager in a daily double or a Final Jeopardy scenario. And right now, one of the things I wanted to look at in my book is we're very much in kind of the Moneyball era of Jeopardy, in that there has been, just over the last like 5-10 years, a sort of statistical revolution amongst Jeopardy contestants, where people are now kind of turning to this vast store of data about games, about strategies, about what has worked and what does not work, and figuring out, no, these are the clear-cut best practices. You don't bet just because you like a category or don't like a category. There's so much more going on. And that is increasingly mainstream. So those are kind of the main strategies at work. And then obviously there's a lot to do with the buzzer, which I can talk more about if you would like to hear about it, but there's a lot going on there too.
Maybe a little bit about the buzzer, because I know that there are people actually go so far as to make their own buzzers to practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the buzzer is a huge part of Jeopardy gameplay. One of the kind of downsides to Jeopardy being designed for the audience at home is the show has always insisted on having the host finish reading every word of the clue, and then you can ring in. You cannot ring in before that moment. And what that means is, I've had it described to me as a reaction time test tacked on to a trivia time test. Or a trivia test, I'm sorry. And you have to be just incredibly precise, and you don't really know if you have the right timing or not, so you're up there on the Jeopardy side. Ken Jennings has said that it's like an Olympic sport if everybody you were watching in the Olympics was playing the sport for the very first time. And that's really what it's like. It is so important to Jeopardy gameplay, and you can try your best and you just don't know if you have it. So people do build these homemade buzzers, and there are past champions who actually sell buzzers that they have designed to mimic the ones on Jeopardy. There's a former contestant, Fritz Holznagel, who was incredibly successful in the 1990s, won a whole bunch of money. He has written an actual book about buzzer best practices, and he got there by doing something like tens or hundreds of thousands of reps on his homemade buzzer, and came up with these best practices like always use your dominant hand, always use your thumb on your dominant hands, keep your hand in front of you, chug a cup of coffee before you walk out on the stage to get that little incremental caffeine boost. So there are people who spend just an incredible amount of time practicing on the buzzer for the chance of maybe having a slight edge in Jeopardy.
I was really impressed in your book by the Jeopardy industry. that there are conventions and that there are alumni groups. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the wonderful things about Jeopardy, and I think one of the things that keeps people who have been trying to get on the show for a very long time, like going, that makes them really want to do it, even if they are not necessarily going to win fame and fortune from it, is that there is this incredible alumni scene. And it really is kind of like being indoctrinated into this like sacred fraternity of Jeopardy contestants, no matter how you do. Like you lose disastrously your first game, whatever, you're in, you made it, you were on the Jeopardy stage. And so there's an invite only Facebook group that they find the people who are competing, the two new contestants on each day's game, and send them an invitation. And there are many, many thousands of people in that group now. They meet up at conventions. There's an annual convention in Las Vegas called Trivia Nationals that is kind of the go-to spot for a lot of the greats of Jeopardy or future greats of Jeopardy as well. People like Brad Rutter, who you might be aware of, Pam Mueller. Those people are very much regulars at this conference. And then there's a bar in Los Angeles in Santa Monica called O'Brien's that is renowned for having some of just the hardest pub trivia anywhere. And I went to it in the book, and I can attest it is extremely hard. And part of the reason for that is for many years now, it has been kind of like a pilgrimage site for Jeopardy contestants. There are a lot of local LA Jeopardy champs, including Brad Rutter and a whole bunch of others that you might remember, like Jerome Vered, Alan Lynn, who go every week to this. Of course, now it's all online, but it will be in person again someday, and play this incredibly hard game and actually write a lot of the games themselves. So it is, you know, once you're kind of in that family of Jeopardy people, you kind of keep going through it and meeting more people in that little universe. And it is just this incredibly kind of lovely, sunny corner of the internet, really, which is so rare these days. So
yeah, it's nice that the internet is for good instead of evil, right? Did you, can you talk a little bit about all the parodies of Jeopardy, you know, Weird Al and Saturday Night Live and just so many other things? Even, I know in 1983, the Greg Kiln Band, can you talk about all of those things?
yeah, one of the my personal reporting highlights as I was working on the book was I actually was able to speak to Weird Al Yankovic. And the reason I wanted to do that is that in 1983, so the year before Jeopardy came back on the air with Alex Trebek, he had written a spoof of that song, the Greg Kiln Band, Jeopardy, and you guys might be aware of it or remember even the spoof of it, because the spoof was actually also a hit, called I Lost on Jeopardy. And Al had been an incredible fan of the original Jeopardy, the Art Fleming and Don Pardo version of the show. And so that song is very much about that Jeopardy. And in the music video, it's a really fun music video. I highly recommend pulling it up on YouTube or something like that. He actually got Art Fleming and Don Pardo to be a part of it. And it's a lot of fun, but it's about him, of course, going on Jeopardy and, you know, it not working out for him and losing to, I think, a plumber and an architect, both with a PhD, because of course it's Jeopardy. But what's interesting about the show or the song and why I wanted to speak with him is he wrote the song in 1983, but it actually came out in the summer of 1984. So just as the new Jeopardy with Trebek was about to come on the air. And Merv Griffin, the creator of Jeopardy, actually credited Weird Al with really the new Jeopardy's success. I mean, it wasn't known if Jeopardy was going to take off again. It had been canceled back in the 70s due to declining ratings. They revived it for 1 year in the late 70s. Nobody watched it. And it was canceled again. And so it wasn't really known because this was just, I think, like five, 6 years after Jeopardy had last been canceled. It wasn't clear that audience would be there. And Alex Trebek was kind of known for other game shows, but he was not a superstar. And then suddenly this Weird Al song came out just before the new Jeopardy came on the air. It was total chance. Weird Al had no idea that the show was coming. Just total kismet. And it was a hit. And suddenly, everybody was sort of reminiscing about Jeopardy. And I think it had a tremendous amount to do with kind of stirring up that fever for more Jeopardy, and the new Jeopardy was a hit really quickly. So that's spoof one, and then of course there's spoof two, which is the Saturday Night Live Celebrity Jeopardy sketches that they had run for years and years with Will Ferrell. And a wonderful tradition that Alex Trebek had was when they filmed Jeopardy in the studio, I was talking about how it was so fast and it was basically done in real time, and that kind of also applied to the commercial breaks. They of course were not showing the commercials in the studio, but they would break the show, pause for exactly the length of what would end up being the commercial once it was actually on television. And in the meantime, Trebek would use those periods to just sort of take questions from the audience, the studio audience, because they have about 150 people in the studio audience on normal days, obviously not right now. And every single time, without question, he would get asked, like, Mr. Trebek, aren't you offended by Will Ferrell's impression of you on Saturday Night Live? And it really is this kind of mean impression of him, right? It's like, if you hated Jeopardy, that's what you would think of with Alex Trebek, that he's mean, he's condescending, he hates his contestants, he thinks they're idiots. I mean, of course, on Saturday Night Live, they very much were, but he can't wait to get out of there. He's just so dismissive. And Trebek loved it. He would say no, like, on the contrary, he thought it was so funny. And in fact, the one that he liked even more than that was the original Trebek stand-up, which was Eugene Levy on SCTV some years before that, which actually was the direct inspiration for the SNL version, where he was even meaner. He hated his contestants even more. He, made even more fun of them. Yeah. And Trebek had such a sense of humor about himself.
Did he ever meet Will Ferrell?
Yes, absolutely. He I know they met a number of times. The one that comes to mind, though, is actually Will Ferrell's last SNL episode as a cast member. Trebek did a cameo in the Celebrity Jeopardy sketch. So he actually walked out onto the Saturday Night Live stage and kind of interrupted Will Ferrell, looking very much like Will Ferrell. And it was really a wonderful moment.
I bet the crowd went wild.
Undoubtedly.
And I know he was also on Cheers. Alex Trebek, he was on The Simpsons. Can you tell us a few stories about that? Other shows he was in?
Yeah, I mean, so like I mentioned before, he really did kind of want to be an actor. Like, he kind of stumbled into hosting game shows, and that was really not his plan. And he said in his early years of hosting before Jeopardy came along that he kind of felt trapped a little bit by it. He got kind of written off as a game show host, like, and you just get stuck doing it, and then nobody else thinks, or nobody will ever think of you as anything else. So I think he was kind of sad about that for a little while, but again, I think he did fall in love with Jeopardy. So all's well that ends well. But then Cheers came along, and I'm not sure exactly who at Cheers had the idea to reach out to him, but he always said that was the first big cameo that he did. And of course, it's that incredible Cliff Clavin episode where he makes it to Jeopardy. He mops the floor with everybody, and then he bets everything. He gets too cocky, bets everything on Final Jeopardy, and he blows it. And he guesses, what are three people who've never been in my kitchen?
Right.
Yeah, and that led to his joke about that was always that he went to the Cheers set to do that scene, and they only had a couple lines for him, and he did really well. And then he came back the next day and they had more lines for him, and then he came back the next day and they had more lines for him, and that kicked off this incredible spree of, especially in the 90s, all these cameo appearances where he kind of played himself in most of them. But I think he kind of got that taste of acting that he had originally moved to LA for.
So let's talk about the clues. Who writes the clues? Who determines what the clues are? How do they avoid being corrupted?
Yeah, well, I will say it is a highly secretive business because of this federal law. They take it extremely seriously and very much kind of keep the writers at arm's length from contestants and from anybody who might be after intel about what's coming up on Jeopardy. But they have a team of 15 full-time writers and researchers, many of whom, especially the actual writers, have been there for just decades and decades. Like Jeopardy, but especially I think amongst the writers, is a place where you stay and you kind of go on forever. Trebek used to joke that it was an annuity for Jeopardy staff members. And the writers specialize in different kind of corners of Jeopardydom, I guess, for lack of a better word, where there are people who kind of specialize in the pop culture clues or the sports clues or the history clues, and then they all sit down together at these kind of like raucous writer meetings. They've compared themselves sort of to librarians, and try to build games that have the right mix of different subjects and that have kind of that right balance of levity and seriousness, and also trying to figure out which clue is harder than which. I think that is a really tricky part of their job, because when you watch Jeopardy, you want the bottom of the board to be much harder than the top, but that it's really kind of tricky to figure out, like, well, what is a more obvious thing about whatever the subject is? And sometimes that's obvious, but sometimes it really is a judgment call by them. So it's these very smart people kind of debating what is obscure and what is not.
So someone asks, how did you get on the show? And how did you apply? How often did you apply? What did you do? And I guess another way of looking at that is, how did you find this story and get access?
Yeah, so I have never been on Jeopardy. I will never be on Jeopardy. I am far too dumb, but also I know way too many people at Jeopardy now, because of course one of the parts of this federal law is that if you know anybody who works for the show in even the most peripheral capacity, you cannot compete on the show, because they don't want it to even seem like there's just the possibility that you would have an unfair advantage. So yeah, for me, I mean, it really just goes back to starting to watch the show more seriously with my fiance, and kind of fall in love with it. And there tragically are not that many reporters who report very seriously very often on Jeopardy. We're trying to fix that, but so I think I was kind of aware of Jeopardy. Jeopardy was kind of aware of me, and the first time I ever actually went to the Jeopardy set was in January 2019, which was when they were filming the All-Star Games, which was that, if you remember, that kind of kooky team tournament they had, where they had 15 notable champs from years past come in and work together as teams, which is sort of heresy in the world of Jeopardy, which is so much an individual competition. So that led to me, getting to know a whole bunch more people, both at the show and on the contestant side, and somehow it snowballed into a whole book.
Yeah, a successful book, right?
We like to think so.
And once again, for those who missed it, and you can get this book at Union Public Library. Let's have a little, commercial too. We do curbside service. If you don't know what that is, you can ask me, and all of that stuff. Okay, did Alex know she was writing her book? If so, did she consult him? How long was her book in the works?
Oh, that's a good question, and one I wish I had a more definitive answer to. He certainly knew that I had reported on Jeopardy and was reporting on Jeopardy. And I think probably he knew that there was a book coming. His book, some of you may have read his memoir that came out last July, and that was announced. Yeah, you got it right there. It's a great read. A lot of funny stories about kind of his early career, early life. But that I think actually he had talked about the timeline of that, and that came about after my book. So I don't know, maybe he found out I was writing my book and was just up in arms about it. It's like, oh, no, I'll tell that story better. But of course, my book is about much more than Alex Trebek. So Yeah, I don't know. I had sent a couple early copies to Jeopardy in the weeks before his passing, because that was when the printed copies kind of first arrived. And I wish I knew if he had seen them. Of course, you know, he was going through quite a bit at the end, and I'm sure he had much better things to do than read my book about his job. But yeah, so I don't know. I like to think so, but
He worked to the very end, right? When he was in pain?
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in early 2019, and I mean, he was very upfront, very vocal about how tough it was, and how grueling chemo was, and you know, all the surgeries he had, and you know, he kind of dared people to, you know, figure out when he started wearing a hairpiece, and I mean, he to the end was very self-deprecating and had a great sense of humor. But yeah, I mean, he was going through so much, and his last day in the studio was just a week and a half before he passed. And the executive producer of Jeopardy, this guy named Mike Richards, has said that he was actually in communication with Trebek. I think it was just 4 days before he passed, and Trebek was saying, "Oh no, I'll be in the studio next week. Like we'll you know, keep going. Don't cancel the taping." So, I mean, he really loved it, and I mean, he said that, you know, as even when he was going through so much, and I mean, pancreatic cancer is a terrible disease. Even as he was going through that, he said that, you know, getting out onto that Jeopardy set, and walking out, and you know, and here's the host of Jeopardy, Alex Trebek, you know, the Johnny Gilbert booming voice. He said that was, you know, he felt like himself, and he was able to forget about everything else and forget about this disease, and just kind of enjoy doing the show.
Yeah. How did you meet Johnny Gilbert?
I wish I had been able to speak to him more for the book. I've spoken to him very briefly, but these days, I mean, so he's 92, and with the pandemic, he's been fully remote this season, and in recent seasons, pre-pandemic, he would spend mornings of tape days remote, and then back tape those early recordings. So, you know, a funny thing about recent seasons of Jeopardy is that, you know, when Trebek would say like, "Oh, thank you, Johnny. Thanks, Johnny Gilbert," after being introduced on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday games, which are the games that they tape in the morning on tape days, he was actually just saying that to somebody else, usually Sarah Whitcomb Foss of the Clue Crew, who was just standing in as Johnny. So Johnny was not actually there for those games.
So everybody wants to know, and one person was brave enough to ask, what do you think are the chances of a success of Ken Jennings as a host? What do you think the chances of success of the chase? It seems to me that Ken Jennings can succeed at one, but not both, since one rolled man's okay? And while the other demands humility, you know that word. And I don't know whether the person would like to talk themselves, but maybe, do you know enough from what I said?
Yeah, yes, I know a bit about this. I mean, I should preface all of this by saying that I am not exactly a neutral party on Ken. I know Ken. He very kindly wrote the foreword to my book. So you might be looking for a more neutral voice than I can offer on this question. But I don't know about you guys, but I have been blown away by how good he's been. He's been hosting Jeopardy. This will be his 7th episode tonight. He taped, I think it's 6 weeks worth of episodes. So we'll be seeing a good stretch of him. And I mean, I think he's been really good at it. And I think a lot of Jeopardy fans were really kind of nervous about, like, I mean, of course, how do you follow Trebek? How do you do that? But he's kind of been open about it, starting every episode, but sort of talking about how he's not Trebek, and he knows he's not Trebek, and he wishes it were Trebek there instead of him. But he's been good. He's been fun. He has so much of, I think, what people really liked about Trebek, in that, you know, of course, we know for a fact that Ken is very bright, that he cares very much about trivia, because we have seen him win quite a lot of Jeopardy games over the years. But he's also kind of funny. He does have that sort of soft edge to himself, where he's kind of rooting for the contestants a little bit. Even as he is occasionally teasing them for their quirky hobbies, of course. So with the Chase is this other game show. It's on ABC. It just launched like 2 weeks ago. James Holzhauer and Brad Rutter are rotating chasers, as they're called on the show. And the conceit of the show basically is they have a noted trivia mastermind. So one of the three of them, you only do one at a time, basically faces off against three challengers in a single episode of the game. And also the premise of the show is that the chaser, because they are trying to defeat those three contestants, is kind of giving them a hard time. He's talking down to them and, saying like, how dare you come here? You don't know beans. Yeah, I mean, I think what I will say about the Chase is I like the Chase. I think it's a good show. It is like Jeopardy, a show that really wants to be a quiz show and have kind of a lot of material and serious material. It's not like nothing against Wheel of Fortune or any of these zanier games, but it is a show that is really about the trivia material, like Jeopardy. And I do think that it is intended as a short thing. It is not that the Chase is going to be on with these three every Thursday night for years and years to come. I think maybe we'll see another season, perhaps, depending on how it does, depending on what the people at ABC decide. But I don't think that's seen as like a permanent posting, probably, for any of them. But what I will say is, well, obviously that is sort of a different character, and I think Ken probably was a little too nice when he's only had his one Chase episode air so far, and I think he was a little friendlier than he probably should have been. Trebek, especially in the early years of Jeopardy, also hosted a bunch of other shows. Like he hosted the Pillsbury Bake Off, and there were a whole bunch of other game shows that weren't as successful as Jeopardy that he was kind of doing on the side. So I don't think that having kind of involvement with other game shows is at all disqualifying for Jeopardy. But they have said that they want whoever the next host is to have it be their main job. So somebody like Anderson Cooper, who's mentioned a lot in kind of rumors about who might be considered as the next host of Jeopardy, he of course is very successful on CNN, and it's probably more difficult to imagine that he would fully walk away from CNN to do Jeopardy, even though it is this great gig where you work 46 days a year. But we'll see, I guess.
Yeah, somebody was, just to follow that up, and Amy, I'm going to get to your question next. Two questions actually. Other than Ken Jennings, who do you think would be good? And I know that we've heard about Katie Couric, and do you think a male or a female would be good? And there's some sports star who I don't know who it is, who's apparently
Aaron Rodgers, yeah, the Packers. Yep.
So who do you think would be good? Maybe you'll do it.
I do not think so. I don't think anybody needs me on TV 5 nights a week. But what I will say about Trebek is, I mean, I asked him a few times, surely you've thought about it, like, who do you think should take over Jeopardy, or who would you want to see take over Jeopardy after you step away from the show? And he, for the most part, made clear that he really didn't want to be the person to choose his successor, and he didn't. And that was very intentional, because he really wanted that person to have a chance to make Jeopardy their own, in the same way that he did when he took over the show. Art Fleming was a very different host of Jeopardy than he was. He was very affable. He was very humble. He would make jokes about how he didn't know any of the material, and he was just glad that he had the answers in front of him, because otherwise, he wouldn't be in that studio at all. And Trebek, of course, kind of played a very different character. He was kind of the stern school teacher a lot of the time. And yeah. I think that was jarring for people who were Art Fleming fans. And then suddenly there was this very different host of Jeopardy. But I think Trebek wanted whoever comes next to have that opportunity to make the show their own, and recognizing that it will be different, and that it should probably be different, because you don't want somebody who's just trying to do an Alex Trebek impression, because Alex Trebek was Alex Trebek, and there isn't another. There's nobody who's going to do that like he did.
It would be funny if Carol was the next host.
Yeah. Oh, I would love to see. I mean, they have said that they will keep announcing more guest hosts. I think they're going to continue having guest hosts for the duration of this season, which tapes through April and airs through July. So basically, until July, we're going to keep seeing rotations of guest hosts, and that includes Aaron Rodgers of the Packers, and it includes this actress from Big Bang Theory, and includes Kitty Couric, Bill Whitaker from 60 Minutes, they've said, and Mike Richards, the executive producer of Jeopardy. I think those are the names they've announced so far, but there are more to come. And I would, oh my goodness, I would love to see Will Ferrell get an episode, especially since Trebek did love his version of Celebrity Jeopardy so much. But Trebek did say that, I mean, he was very aware that even now most game show hosts are white men, and he, I mean, I think he said that it would be lovely for, you know, Jeopardy, the next host of Jeopardy, to be somebody who didn't necessarily look like him. And I don't think that is maybe the only thing that the people involved will use to decide who comes next, but I think that, you know, he certainly wasn't wrong. And you know, seeing some diversity in that kind of sector of entertainment, I think would be important, would be lovely. And there are a lot of people like LeVar Burton and Meredith Vieira are names that I've heard over and over and over as possibilities. So I'm excited to see what happens, really. But I think they get the kind of you want somebody who seems serious about Jeopardy. It can't be like a comedy variety hour. There's just not room for it on a show like Jeopardy. So I don't think it will be a drastic change, at least in the permanent host.
So, and just a quick question, how long did it take to put your book together, to write it?
Yeah, it was fast for a book. So I first started to talk about turning my reporting and expanding, obviously significantly, my reporting into a book in May of 2019. And I handed in the first draft March 2020 and the final draft like late May 2020. So it was about a year between like, okay, yeah, let's do this as a book, and you know, here's the manuscript. Oh my God. Yeah, many sleepless nights in between that. So
they knew a good thing when they saw it, in other words.
Oh, I like to think so, but I mean, there have been some great books about Jeopardy and a lot of books by former contestants, but there hadn't been much in the way of reporting on it and actually kind of, you know, going out and interviewing people, and that was really what I wanted to do.
So Amy asks, do you think James' playing style has changed the way people play the game?
You know what? I have actually, this season, it really feels that way, especially over the last like few weeks. It really feels like we're seeing more people, you know, start from the bottom of the board, but especially go all in on daily doubles like that. Don't steal this article idea, because I've been wanting to do kind of an analytical look at it, but it does feel like now we are seeing people lean more often than not towards going all in for daily doubles, which I really don't think was the norm. And I think, you know, he didn't really invent any of those strategies, but I think he did a lot to popularize them. And yeah, so I think it's entirely possible. But to play like him, to win as much money as him, to go from, you know, across the hardest clues to start off, and to bet reliably as much as you can, or nearly as much as you can, you have to be so good. You have to be really good on the buzzer, but you also have to have just an incredible trivia mind. Like, he missed an average of 1 clue per game, which is just baffling. So, you know, he, in addition to having this incredible strategy that he, you know, fearlessly carried out, he was really good at it. And if you do not have, if you're missing even one piece of what made him so good, like, you are going to be in a big negative money hole real fast.
Yeah. So what happens to Jeopardy winners? Has it changed anybody's lives significantly?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good one. I mean, I think that, you know, for Jeopardy is interesting because even now the average winnings are just about $20,000 in a normal season, and you will end up paying about half of that in tax. And I don't think any of us would turn down 10 grand, right? But Jeopardy has not made very many people actually, you know, wealthy. There are games, I mean, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, right? You win $1 million, and the number of people who've won $1 million on Jeopardy, like including tournaments, is single digits. I'm not even sure it's more than 5 total people. So I think, having said that, I mean, there are cases like Ken Jennings, right, where Ken, when he first went on Jeopardy, was kind of muddling through a career as a computer engineer. He was a programmer, and he really didn't like it. He didn't think he was very good at it. Lived in Salt Lake City. He was kind of newly out of college, living with his wife, and it enabled him to just kind of start over and just decide what he wanted to do, because obviously he did win quite a lot of money, and he has become an author, and he has a podcast, and he is very funny, and he got to kind of explore this whole other side of who he might have been, and just kind of start over. And there are a lot of stories like that amongst Jeopardy champions. Like Dave Madden was able to start I'm forgetting the name of his organization, but it's kind of Quiz Bowl adjacent. He runs a National Geography bee and a few other international and national contests for high school kids especially. And so there are a lot of people who've used the money that they made from Jeopardy, even if it was not necessarily a like, oh, I can go buy a yacht now amount of money, to sort of redirect their lives that way.
What is James doing now?
James is doing much the same. He's still living in Las Vegas with his family, his wife and their young daughter. And he's still gambling. He's still placing bets. Yeah, I mean, he's certainly hinted that we will see more down the line. And of course, he's on The Chase, which has been really fun. His episode just aired last week. And he, as you might imagine, if you are familiar with his Twitter presence, he makes for quite a good villain. So he's a lot of fun. And he and Brad Rutter, I should also say, sweetly kind of blurbed my book. And James had some funny quote about how if you read it, you can lose on Jeopardy just like him. So take it from James.
So I do want to open this up to people, and I've asked everyone to unmute themselves because we're coming to an end here. So I do want to encourage everybody to get their questions in. Does anyone have a question at this point? This whole program's on questions. I would think people would have questions. But
I have a question.
Okay, that's Linda Barrett. Linda.
How did the Think music come into being?
That was the one I forgot about. Yes. Merv Griffin actually wrote the Think music. He began his career as a musician and was a very talented singer and a very talented songwriter. And he, I think as the story goes, ended up house sitting. I forget if he was house sitting for Marlon Brando in New York or house sitting where Marlon Brando's old piano was, but he ended up kind of inheriting Marlon Brando's piano, and he kind of famously wrote the Think music, that song that they play during Final Jeopardy that I will not try to hum, but I'm sure you know how it goes. He wrote that in just I think a few minutes, and he actually originally wrote it for his then infant son Tony, who has since made somewhere around $80 million, the Merv Griffin estate from the royalties for the Think music and for the Jeopardy theme song, which they've retained for all these years.
So all we need to do is come up with a music in 2 or 3 minutes, and we can win that money. I'm going to give my ending now, but then I'm going to still leave it open for questions. So of course, first I want to thank Claire. I mean, you're vivacious. I really think you should be the host. And you shared your expertise with us. It's a very generous thing to do. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you will like us on Facebook, and follow us on Facebook, and give us permission to add your name to our newsletter list, which will be a way for you to find out about programs. Just so you know, in February, next week, we have how to build your own emotional toolbox, which I'm going to sign up for, as well as February, we're going to have the Negro Baseball League, Broadway costume designer tells all. He's got really good gossip. And Sinatra, we're doing a program on Frank Sinatra from someone who really knew him. So I want to thank you all again for joining, but I do want to ask if anyone else has, okay, we have another question. Kathy asks, do you have a favorite episode or player moment?
Ooh, oh my goodness. That's like choosing a favorite child is how I feel about it. I love the funny Q&As. There's one where from just a few years ago, and I'm blanking on her name, which is horrible, but she had a really funny story about a really funny, weird, horrible, tragic story. I should preface this with about having a pygmy goat, I think, and it got into a bag of like quick dry concrete that she had in her backyard, and Trebek was kind of baffled by this story. I'm ruining a joke, so I apologize for that. But Trebek was kind of baffled by it, and it turned out it did not end well for the goat, which is sad.
No.
I'm just curious, when the people stay at the hotel, because I know Merv Griffin owns the Beverly Hills, used to, when he was alive. Do they stay there?
Oh man, I bet they would love that. But no, the times have sadly changed. They stay at there are a couple hotels that are not particularly nice that are pretty close to the studios. There's like a DoubleTree and something else right across the freeway from that. So they're not very nice hotels, but you get like a slight discount if you are a Jeopardy contestant, and that's where the Jeopardy shuttle comes. So they pick you up there. A really fun thing about that is that the hotel bar on the nights that Jeopardy tapes is full of these like shell-shocked Jeopardy contestants who either just won a bunch of money or have just had their hearts broken and are preparing to go back home and have to keep the secret for 2 months until their episodes air. So it's a really funny place to kind of spy, which is what I did, of course. So.
The reason I'm asking was one New Year's I went for the Rose Bowl parade, and I had a package deal. And one of the things was that we went there to the Beverly Hills downstairs, and they had a big catering event for us. And I had a chance to walk around the place, and it was really awesome. And I'm going back some years though.
So, Iris, did you have a question? Yes, no?
I do.
Okay, Linda?
How long is the average Jeopardy contestant there?
What do you mean? Like at the actual set?
Right. So they know when they're going to be on. So they go like a day ahead and then leave the day after, or how does that usually work?
Yeah. Most people are there kind of for the minimum of time, both because they're paying out of pocket for this experience, but also because Jeopardy tapes on Tuesdays and Wednesdays usually. So you're not only paying, but you're missing work for it probably.
Yeah.
So they will usually kind of just fly out maybe the day before. Usually you get the call, is what people call it. They actually like capitalize it in the contestant community. You get the call to come on to Jeopardy, and that usually is like somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks before your actual tape date. So they spend that time studying like crazy, practicing buzzer skills, and then go out to LA for usually just a couple days.
Do they cycle through topics on a regular basis? Asks Amy. I can imagine getting on and the topics being heavy on geography and baseball, which would be awful.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much a game of luck as well, because you either know the categories or not, right? Like, I'm sure there are categories where if they came on, you'd be delighted by it. You'd be like, oh, wow, I absolutely know these, but maybe you just get the game that happens to have geography and baseball. And yeah, I think they try not to put the same like subject matter in games close to each other. So they try to kind of space out like what state was Abraham Lincoln born in, or things like that. Obviously asked more creatively than that, by at least like a few years. But of course things like American presidents will come up quite often. So
I think that one of the things that was funny in the book was, I don't know if you guys know who Cliff Clavin is and Cheers, but he was the mailman. And when he was on the categories were like famous presidents of the U.S. Postal Service and stamps, and they were all related to mailmen. And then they were really funny. So my husband notes that they have a concentrated interest in English monarchy history.
They do. Yeah, this is. Yeah, I mean, this is such a thing that, I mean, like amongst Jeopardy contestants or aspiring Jeopardy contestants, there are these things, and in those other Jeopardy books written by former contestants, those are great kind of guides to what you might find on Jeopardy. And the English monarchy absolutely is one of those things where you better know it cold. You better know dates and centuries and order of kings, and what exactly happened to each of Henry VIII's wives and all that stuff.
So, okay.
Have they ever?
So someone makes it a point to say, I didn't order the other Jeopardy books, only yours, for those who
I'm honored. Thank you very much.
Have they ever repeated any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they've ever repeated any word for word. I think they certainly try not to do that, but definitely like they will be asking about the exact same, you know, it'll be like a slightly different phrasing of what is really the same question.
what would be your topics that you would exceed in?
Did I not already cover that I would not ever make it to Jeopardy? Yeah, I love their wordplay ones. Those are the ones that I tend to do okay at. And I don't know, like Virginia Woolf, like I took a Virginia Woolf course once, so I'm like, okay, I know that above average, right? We've all got our like little thing that is either an obsession or you happen to take a class on, or you know, you read a book about once or whatever it is, and you know, maybe you get lucky and maybe you don't, which is why it's so amazing to see people like James Holzhauer, or you know, Pam Mueller or Buzzy Cohen or Austin Rogers go on for game after game, because they undoubtedly have weak categories too, and they're able to just get through them anyway and win.
Last chance for questions. And all of us in our head should now playing the Jeopardy music in our head. So this is what is your last question? Well, I have an answer, which is thank you so much. It was really lovely having you here this afternoon. I had fun. I hope other people did too, based on the chat they did. So I'm going to end the meeting and ask you again to please sign up for our newsletter. Put your email, you can send it to me in chat, or I will send a follow-up email to everybody. And I really, really encourage you to sign up, because not all programs are as much fun as this one, but we have a lot of really great programs. Thanks, Claire in Washington. Good luck living in Washington for the next few days.
Yeah, I might need some luck. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. And thank you all for spending some time with me.
It was great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
All righty.